here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. 6 months since the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began, there is still no sign of a ceasefire, let alone a peace agreement. The hostilities are a shocking reminder of how a situation can easily take a turn for the worst. Millions of people have forced to flee their homes, and the conflict has battered the world economy, which is still struggling to recover from a prolonged pandemic. Europe in particular has struggled with an unprecedented energy crisis as a result of US-led sanctions on Russia, oil and gas. How will Russia-Ukraine conflict likely pan out, and in what other ways besides food and fuel supplies could it affect the world? For Russia and Ukraine conflict in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian political and defense analyst. In Karlovy Vary, Peter Dickinson, the publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. In Shanghai, Shending Li from the Institute of International Studies with Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So how would you describe 6 months into this war? Where is Russia? Where is Ukraine? Let's go with Mr. Dickinson first.
It's good to join you. I think at this stage, from a Ukrainian perspective, the mood is one of determination, of resilience for the mood in the country. It's been a very, very traumatic 6 months, but it's also been a period of great of national awakening, and many Ukrainians now believe that although the road ahead is challenging, they do think ultimately the country will come through victorious.
Interesting, you talk about the mood in Ukraine. If that is the angle you choose, then I have to present the same angle to the Russian panelist, just to be fair. What about the mood in Moscow and in Russia about this conflict?
Well, actually, the Russian public has been kind of fed up with this conflict, and right now it's not really that much interested. There's a lot of apathy. Of course, the Russian media is reporting a lot about what's happening, but the public is interested much less. It's more interested in things that affect families, the coming 1st of September, beginning of the education year, which is always a big event in Russia.
So how do you think 6 months into this war, it is shaping Ukraine?
Well, I think one of the key issues, of course, if we look at the battlefield, Ukraine was not expected to put up much of a fight. The assumption, certainly in Russia, certainly in the West, and frankly speaking, amongst many Ukrainians, was that Ukraine would not be able to put up much of a fight against a full-scale invasion. There is a growing sense of confidence and a growing faith in the country's military, and yet at the same time, Ukraine still lacks the military muscle, as it were, the weapons, to launch major counteroffensives. And after 6 months of very debilitating conflict, Ukraine is very heavily dependent on the supplies of arms it receives from the country's Western partners.
How is this war reshaping Russia?
Right now, there are no direct flights from Russia to many parts of the world. And of course, the European airspace is all closed. That means getting out of Russia is quite a problem. That concerns a lot of people, especially during the summer when the vacation season. A lot of Western companies have left and people are losing their jobs.
How will this conflict continue to impact on both the energy and food supply?
Well, the business situation in Ukraine is very negative, is very bleak, as you would imagine, with 20% of the country under Russian occupation, and crucially still the Black Sea ports of the country, which are the main gateway for all Ukraine's exports, under a partial blockade. Now we have had an agreement reached in the past month to allow some Ukrainian agricultural exports to leave Ukrainian ports. This was an agreement brokered by the United Nations and Turkey with both Russia and Ukraine in parallel, rather than between each other bilaterally. That has somewhat eased the blockade, but it's a very partial lifting. So we can still talk about a partial blockade. So the economic situation is very grim for Ukraine.
Mr. Falkenhauer, the energy issue is a big one Russia has with European countries, particularly Germany. Now, it seems that Russia does have some bargaining power. How is it making use of it so far? What is the latest situation? How much will that be able to support both the political agenda and the economic agenda by the current administration in Russia?
Well, there's a belief in Moscow that it's impossible to isolate Russia, that there's going to be a bleak winter coming for the Europeans with lack of or a very small supply of Russian natural gas and primarily also Russian oil, and that will there will be political repercussions and actually the Russian favor, that the Europeans will blink, that there's going to be support for Ukraine is going to begin to crumble, that there's going to be pressure on European governments. So this is coming winter is seen as very decisive.
What about Russia's trade link with Central Asian countries and also with neighbors like China? How much is Russia articulating this in its overall economic approach?
Well, these links have become essential because trade with China continues and with Central Asian republics too, whereas with the Western partners, which are now not partners but maybe more enemies than partners, trade has collapsed. There are logistical problems, there's very serious sanctions. So this is an outlet for Russia right now.
Professor, in Shanghai, I guess a fair question for you is how do you see it's not just an armed conflict, but how this event is changing the geopolitical landscape and the future trends likely in international relations?
As the military action is still going on in that part of the world, it's hard for Russia to improve its relationship with EU, with Western part of the world. And Russia is likely to face more green economic prospect with such a sanction to be more effective in the coming months. So in my personal opinion, Russian side need to adjust its approach to be realistic by showing its sincerity in launching talk and by providing some concession. At the same time, Western supply of financial supply and military equipment to Ukraine indeed could help Ukraine for the moment to a large extent. But fundamentally, it's up to Ukraine government and people for their own willingness to bear the consequences of such a torch. At the same time, while they count on the Western supply, they should build their own ability in showing flexibility and showing their sincerity in talking to Russia and other stakeholders, and by giving their own concession.
Is it possible, Mr. Dickinson?
Well, the issue of talks is always on the table. There is always room for negotiation. But at this stage, the mood certainly in Ukraine is that there's very little to talk about. Russia has been quite clear that it does not see a future for the Ukrainian state, that it does not see a negotiated settlement with Ukraine as it is. It sees Ukraine as an obstacle to peace. It sees peace essentially as a return of Russian domination. So it doesn't leave a lot of room from a Ukrainian perspective to negotiate with.
So, Mr. Falkenhauer, from the Russian perspective, how do you see this war is reshaping Russia, particularly the geopolitics, some people suggest, for months and probably even years to come?
Well, this is going to be a very defining moment for the Russian state as it is right now. That's how it's seen from the Kremlin, that this is going to defy Russia. It's seen that Russia is resisting a world dominated by the United States and its allies and promoting a new world order, and that will require, of course, a lot of suffering and effort. The Russian public is maybe not so really keen about these changing the world order, but it's right now there's support for the Kremlin, there's support for their effort in this conflict. So it's defined by the Kremlin, and it's right now their conflict, their war, and they believe they're going to win it and establish Russia as a dominant power in the region.
Mr. Shen, your thoughts?
Probably NATO would be revitalized with the threat perception they are having now, given this conflict in Ukraine, and given Finland and Sweden to join NATO, and probably transatlantic strategic partnership would be strengthened at least for the remaining 2 years of the Biden administration. In the meantime, Russia would likely be more isolated for the coming years. Russia would feel a chilly, green regional strategic environment.
Mr. Dickinson, we see a regional conflict or a conflict between two countries now being framed as a conflict between Russia and the West. And also we see at the same time different layers of geopolitics are evolving also. How do you read the general picture?
Well, it's very interesting to point out from a Ukrainian point of view. Ukrainians don't see this as a geopolitical conflict. They don't see this as a confrontation between Russia and the West. Frankly, they'd probably much prefer that it was that. Ukrainians see this as part of a nation-building process of Ukraine emerging, first of all in 1991 from the Soviet Union, from centuries of Russian domination, to spend about 30 years essentially still within the Russian sphere, gradually trying to pull away, trying to reassert a very old, ancient European identity. And now this war is the last phase of that process in many respects. Ukrainians would like to see the West more involved, actually, than they are.
How sustainable do they see these kinds of quote-unquote honeymoon in a way as a result of a very sad armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine led to closer relationship Ukraine has with its European partners?
Well, certainly Ukraine must look to stand on its own 2 feet. There are limits to Western support, and I think that's well understood in Kiev. At the moment, in the immediate future, Ukraine, for practical reasons, will remain fairly dependent, but it will need to move away from that as soon as possible, because there is a limit to the amount of patience the West will have, the resources the West will have. Ultimately, it's not sustainable to support Ukraine or to have Ukraine essentially on life support from Western aid. So they need to move in that direction, and that's going to be a huge challenge going forward. But I think at the same time, there is an understanding that that the Western world recognizes and Ukraine recognizes that it'd be very, very dangerous to allow Russia to succeed. It's much cheaper, if we want to talk in purely financial terms or economic terms or even geopolitical capital, it's much cheaper to stop Russia now in Ukraine than to allow the conflict or confrontation to escalate.
The economy worldwide is not necessarily on a very upbeat picture, Mr. Felgenhauer. How do you see this conflict is likely to have an impact further on both the economic and also the political front?
There's economists are talking about a possible recession in Europe, very possible, maybe also in North America, and maybe worldwide. And Moscow would see that as a bonus because it would be Russia would be pushing forward the position that this is because of the conflict in Ukraine, that it should end. And right now, for Russia, actually, it would want it to end. But then, of course, Russian favorable terms, which Ukraine right now is not accepting and the West is supporting. So there's hope that there's going to be a rethinking of this situation as the world economy goes into some kind of form of recession in the West. And without Western support, Ukraine cannot possibly sustain a all-out conflict with much bigger and stronger and richer Russia. So that's seen as a way forward to end this conflict on Russian terms.
Thank you so much for all of you for joining us on this discussion. Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow, Peter Dickinson in Karlovy Vary, and Shending Li in Shanghai. Appreciate it. Thank you.